I've got a special treat for you today. This is an interview that I gave to the While We're Still Here podcast. This is a podcast that talks about death and dying while we still can. It's an important conversation and covers a lot of important topics. This is one of my favorite interviews I've ever given, and the host, Kathy, does a really good job of getting me to compare and contrast my two roles as a church pastor and a police chaplain. We talk about the dying process, what it's like from my perspective as a police chaplain and also in the church. We talk about making preparations, talk about the relationships of important people who are there to help us when we suffer the death of a loved one. We talk about the trauma that people go through related to death. We cover all kinds of interesting topics. So without any further ado, here's the While We're Still Here podcast.
Well, we're still here, so let's talk about it. Today, we're going to meet Jared Altic. He's a police chaplain and a pastor. He volunteers his time with police officers, going on ride-alongs, listening to their stories, serving their communities, and upholding the laws of the land. As a police chaplain, he spends his days and nights with cops. Cops is what he lovingly calls them, and wants us to know that cops want people to see what they do day in and day out, while at the same time can't believe why anyone would want to be around to see what they see and experience shift after shift. Jared has his own podcast called Hey Chaplain. Here, cops share stories describing what they experience. Jared stands with cops during death investigations and sits with families on scene. In his pastoral work, he helps families plan funerals, deal with grief, and grapple with their faith at their time of loss. Take a listen to Jared's episode number 33, titled The Death Investigator. Jared and I are like-minded in the death conversation. I took this quote from his show notes. Quote, "I want to encourage you to not shy away from difficult topics like death." Unquote. I hope you take a listen to his show, specifically episode 33. Let's meet Jared.
Hi, Kathy. How are you?
Doing okay, thank you. Let's jump right in. I've described you as a police chaplain and a pastor. And in the space of my show, we talk about death and dying and being prepared, knowing what you want at the end of life so that you can tell your family, so that no one is surprised or having to deal with really tough tasks after a loss. As a police chaplain, what is your experience out in the field?
Well, unfortunately, as a police chaplain, I get a front row seat to people who are unprepared for dealing with death. And so I get called out by the department for unattended deaths. So homicides, suicides, accidental deaths, naturals. And by unattended, I mean that there's not a doctor there. And so somebody could die of natural causes, but if they died at home, whether family was with them or they were found the next day or the next week, there needs to be at least some investigation to make sure that there was no foul play. Sometimes the family is pretty distraught. They're in that early stage of shock and, in those first steps of grief. And so they call out a chaplain, and I have two responsibilities. I'm partly there for the officers. That's kind of my long-term role, is to take care of them and talk to them about death and what they experience, the kind of stresses they have. But the short-term responsibility that I have is dealing with those citizens, that family of someone who has just died. And like I said, they're in different stages of just shock and despair. I've had people, laying down in the middle of the street screaming, and other people who are nearly catatonic. I try to act as the spiritual and emotional paramedic, where I am not going to be their long-term care, but I'm going to help get them to some long-term care. If they have other helpers like a counselor or a pastor or a rabbi or whatever, I'm going to bridge the gap in those first few hours to get them to those other helpers. Some of that work is explaining to them what's going to happen next. So let's say they have a loved one, regardless of why the person died. That loved one is dead in the other room. They're gathered either outside the house or in a different part of the house, and I have to walk them through what the investigators are doing, because especially if it's a suspicious death, there may be a crime scene investigators there setting up all kinds of cameras and laser scanners and all kinds of complicated equipment so they can take a 3D image of the entire space around the loved one, including the loved one's body still laying where it was found. And there's photographers who are going to photograph every angle. And that's a pretty unpleasant experience for the family if they're anywhere within visual range. And we try to move them outside of that. We try to move them to where they can't see what's happening. We even have screens we put up. If it's outside, like in a parking lot, we'll put screens around the deceased so that that investigation can happen without onlookers observing it and being traumatized by seeing that. Because if your loved one's laying there, maybe it's a murder and it takes a few hours to investigate, that's upsetting that your family member is laying there for multiple hours. And so the chaplain is one of the individuals who's trying to calm down the onlookers and explain to them that this is not an act of disrespect to your loved one. We are trying to show them the utmost respect by going through all of these procedures very carefully. We're going to dot every I and cross every T. And all of these detectives and crime scene investigators and other police officers are going to do their very best to solve what has happened here, to find the truth so that we can respect your loved one. And I'm trying to explain to this range of individuals, especially if I can, I try to find one individual that I can kind of focus on that can then capture that information and relay it to the rest of the family later. Because some of them, you'll talk to them and they can't hear it because of the distress that they're going through. But I'll explain that, okay, this body is going to be put in a body bag and on a gurney and covered very respectfully and be moved from the home and put into a van and taken to the coroner's office where there'll be postmortem examinations. Maybe it's a full autopsy, maybe it's just a blood test or some appropriate combination of tests that'll take anywhere from a few minutes to a few weeks to get the results back. Then after that point, your loved one will be taken from the coroner's office and be transported again to the funeral home of your choosing. We're not there to recommend funeral homes. A lot of people have never thought about what funeral home they want to use. And I'll ask them, the last time you had a death in your family, what funeral home did you use? That's at least a good starting place to go back to where you went before. And sometimes they don't know. They just have not thought about this. There's no plans. The deceased had no plans. There's nothing to turn to. And frequently I'm navigating my way through this state of confusion. And I'm just trying to point the family to the next steps and to the next helper. Be prepared. The coroner's office is going to call you tomorrow and ask you what funeral home. So you don't have to decide right now, but you're going to want to know where your loved one will be transported to. Here in Kansas City, you see in TV all the time that, they pull the big drawer out and have the family identify the body. And it makes for really good TV, and it makes for a good moment in a movie, but that's not something that happens in very many places, and we don't do it at all. In fact, we will go to great lengths to identify the deceased through all kinds of other means, whether it's through a combination of social media and DNA, fingerprints, and identification they're carrying on their person. There's a list of things we'll go through to identify this person with some certainty without having the family visually identify them, which is overrated.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah.
So TV, as we're learning, really does not illustrate the realities of death and dying. I had an experience with a friend of mine whose husband was killed in a motorcycle crash. And I happened to drive by the scene and I saw his motorcycle. He was covered in a yellow tarp. This was at 5:00 in the afternoon. She was not notified until 2:30 a.m. because they had to use his military ID to identify him. It took, having to go through a chain of command to be able to get him identified, but then also mobilize the chaplaincy team to be able to go out and notify the spouse. What you're saying resonates with me because I wanted to go and be with her to identify his body, and they said, we don't do that here. And it was rather distressing to her to learn that, comforting for me. Well, I'm a believer of once you see it, you can't unsee it.
We're reluctant to further traumatize people. There's a lot of violent deaths that disfigure a person. Mm-hmm. And if a hand and a face, those two body parts specifically, or if they're disfigured, that can be especially upsetting, even to a stranger. And so to see a loved one, and it doesn't, I said violent, but, it doesn't even have to be violent. Someone could die at home alone. And if they fall face first, the blood will pool, at the lowest point. And so half of their face will turn into a terrible purple bruise. Mm-hmm. And it is really difficult to look at because it's just such an unnaturally large area of their face. Is just terrible color. Mm. And we'll have a body being removed from a home, and the family, now that it's not an active crime scene anymore and not an active investigation, they want to see. I try to discourage that. Sometimes a person just looks like they're sleeping and it's not that bad. But if somebody's got an injury or even just bruising that's particularly gruesome, I don't know as though that's the image you want. If you just can wait a day or two, the body will be at a funeral home. The funeral home has techniques to make the body look much more presentable. There can be a viewing in just a couple days. And I'm in favor of letting the family gather around the gurney where the body is inside a body bag with a cover placed over it. And usually those covers are very nice looking. Maybe there's a rose on top, and they can touch and be near, but not look. And I wouldn't encourage it. It's been very few times where I've said, "Oh, you should definitely go see your dead loved one right now." Mm-hmm. I think that can happen later. Because I'm a big believer in having closure. That's why when I, as a pastor doing funerals, I would like the body to be present in the room. Mm-hmm. And whether it's cremains that have been cremated or whether it's, a body in a casket, I think that there's some real tangible, concrete feeling that when we are in the room and that's a body or even a body-shaped box, but we know that they're not alive anymore. And some real closure happens there. And I appreciate that aspect of a funeral service when you can have that kind of closure. But in the moment of a crime scene or something like that, that's not the right time to look, in my opinion. And there are exceptions, but I generally try to discourage it.
Well, thank you for saying that. And it
doesn't happen at the coroner's office anymore.
Well, and thankfully not, because like you said, to be able to, if they're in the home already and the dead person has been there with them in the room already, what you've said mm-hmm. about how you respectfully, or how the team respectfully prepares the body for transport, to actually be able to stand around the body and say whatever they want to say, or like you said, touch the gurney or be close, I think is way better than going to a sterile office where there's no, it's foreign, I guess is the best way.
And a lot of coroners' offices and medical examiners' offices actually have a viewing room. Sometimes state law requires them to have a place for family to view a body. But like I was in Kansas City, Missouri at their medical examiner's office, and they have that room, but it's filled with boxes because they never use it either. Oh. And so it's not really anywhere as common as what television and movies would have you believe, and for good reason. Those viewings can happen in a more controlled setting, a warmer setting with more helpers at a funeral home or a church or something.
Thanks for saying that. Because you do double duty, a police chaplain and a pastor, you're talking about closure for a family that you may never see again, as opposed to a family that you know well. Can you speak a little bit maybe to how the family you will never see again responds to you on scene as opposed to maybe a family you're in relationship with?
I've always been surprised by how grateful they are that I'm there. Because sometimes I really feel awkward. I really feel like there's not a thing I can do for these people. This is so sad and so tragic and so unexpected for them, perhaps. there's just not anything I can say or do. A lot of families are not religious. I mean, because if it's a religious family and I can offer to pray with them, well, that's instant comfort. I speak the same language they speak. There's a connection there. And even if I don't ever see them again, we kind of had that bond. But most families aren't religious. They haven't been religious in decades. And so a lot of these families, they don't really want or would even appreciate or understand someone praying with them. Although I've never had someone turn me down. I can think of visiting people, not in the case of a death, but like visiting people in the hospital. And I can go to somebody who's a strident atheist, but if they're dying of cancer, and I say, hey, can I pray for you? They'll humor me. They'll appreciate that, and a lot of them see it as a kind gesture, even if they don't particularly believe in it. But as a police chaplain, I actually have an extra layer of legality that I have to navigate because I'm representing the government. Mm-hmm. If I'm a pastor visiting a hospital, I'm just representing the church. If I'm a chaplain representing the police department, I'm representing the government. I can't impose on you to pray and whatever. If you ask me, hey, chaplain, can you talk to me about what happens after someone dies? Or can you come say a prayer for us? If you ask me, I can do it. I can't impose that on you, though. And so a lot of these folks, they don't have the same view of death that I have as a religious person. And I don't feel like I have any real words of comfort in the moment of this tragedy to offer them. But at the same time, just being present seems greatly appreciated. And I've been surprised by how deeply they appreciate it. And I've had people hug me and with tears in their eyes, grab my hand with both of their hands to express how moving it was to them that I was there for them. And I'm like, well, I didn't even do anything. But I was present, and I shared in that tragedy. I was present in that moment with them. And that actually did count for a lot. The cops feel it in the same way. The victims' families, they feel it. And it is meaningful for a helper just to be there. So if you're ever in that spot, if you're ever in a position where you're a helper, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. Just being present is actually deeply meaningful to most people from most backgrounds.
I have learned that silence is very important.
Yes. Yeah. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And so, yeah.
Good point.
So that's smart to listen yes. And not talk too much.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It is different. You asked for a contrast. It is different with my church people that I've known, because I've been in the same church for over 20 years. And so I've got people here who I've known them. They're adults now with children of their own, but I knew them when they were kids. And other people where I've known them their entire adult lives. And so this is a connection that is a lot different than my police chaplaincy. I'm often, interacting with them a day or two after the death. In fact, the day that we're recording this right now, I'm meeting with a family here in a few hours because they lost a loved one 3 days ago, and they're at the funeral home right now, and I'm going to meet with them afterward and talk about funeral arrangements. But I have a connection with those family members who go to my church. I've known them for 20 years. That's a different kind of thing. It's more the comfort and security that comes with an old friendship where I know them, I know their extended family, I know the ups and downs, the victories and the tragedies of their life, and I'm just here in yet another chapter of their story. And so there's a closeness and a fondness there that's different than the, hey, that guy was here as a comforting presence in this moment of crisis. They're similar, but they're also a little bit different.
Yes. So let's transition a little bit then, because you just gave us a comparison and a contrast of these folks that you'll never see again and these folks that you've known for 20 years and sometimes probably more. When it comes to things that are said to you after a loved one dies, and I'm really thinking about on scene, this person is in the midst of devastating shock, grief, all sorts of high emotion. Are there utterances there that I never expected something like this to happen? I don't even know what I'm going to do from this point. And a comparison to folks that you've known for a long time a sense of different type of preparedness for a loss in one situation or another?
In regards to preparedness, yes. The folks that have been part of my church, where I'm a preacher, I preach sermons every week, I teach adult classes. A lot of them have had years of us talking about death. And we're evangelical Christians. So, talking about the afterlife, talking about heaven, talking about, facing your mortality and thinking in terms of both now and not yet, that there's this life you're living now, but there's this other life you're going to live for eternity. And so that actually does something to us psychologically. And I feel like that's something, I hate to keep moving on you, but in my chaplaincy, a lot of my long-term care is with police officers who are mostly non-religious. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's been a shift in the last 30 or 40 years because I think that a lot of officers had religious backgrounds back in the day. And a lot of them grew up going to Sunday school. They grew up going to church and grew up talking about death, talking about what it means to live after you die, what kind of things matter in this world. Where do we store up our treasure? Where are the important things for us? Are they right here or are they in the next world? That kind of discussion happening on a weekly basis, week in and week out for years, through your formative years of childhood and on through the rest of your life, that does prepare you a little bit differently than somebody who just doesn't ever think about it. Mm-hmm. Right. And so my cops are now, I'm seeing a generation of young cops who most of them have not been in church. And some of them have. I think church type families probably skew a little bit toward producing people who want to go into law enforcement. And so there's probably a slightly higher number, and not that a lot of cops go to church, but a lot of them were raised in church.
Got it.
But I think that number's lower overall. And so my church people, they've had this discussion with me years ago. They've heard me talk about this. We've discussed it in adult classes, and they've had this stuff on their mind. And there is a preparedness for their own mortality and the mortality of their loved ones because it's something they've talked about. Where, like I said, I've certainly gone out and seen people who have just never, ever, ever thought about their own death because maybe they're scared of it and they've been avoiding it, or they just haven't really given it much thought. They're a little bit scared of it, a little bit superstitious about it, a little bit, anxious. They just can't. And I think the percentage of those people are increasing because our culture overall is less churched. And for all the goods, all the pros and cons that come with having a Christian culture, one of the benefits was talking about death more commonly. Mm-hmm. We were a little more comfortable with the subject. And so maybe there's, like I said, pros and cons to church culture, but that would be one of the advantages coming from a counselor's point of view that, okay, now you got this whole group of people that from cradle to grave have been talking about death. Sure. And so your podcast actually, I think, is going to really, scratch an itch for a lot of people who probably did, way back in the day, they went to church with grandma or something like that, but they haven't really been thinking about death for most of their adult life. And this podcast is going to come in and fill that gap where they really would benefit from looking at it. I've done funerals for 25 years, and I know people that they couldn't come into the funeral home or into the church for their own mother's funeral. Mm-hmm. They sat out in the parking lot. They didn't want to not attend, but they couldn't bring themselves to be in the room with a dead body. There could be different reasons for that, but mostly it's just they really needed to be preparing for this moment years ago. Mm-hmm. And the last few days has not been enough time for them to get ready for it.
Right. I have seen that as well. I was thrown into situations I was not prepared for, but I have learned so much from those. I don't know why I'm in this space, but here I am. And I'm going to roll with it. And I had a conversation yesterday with somebody, and I said to her, if you don't feel like you can speak to your children about what you want, call me, I'll record you, and we can send it to them. Not a podcast, but just you talking. Yeah. And give it to them so that she gets her needs met and they get the important information that they need or will need. even though they don't see it right now. But what I appreciate about the way you kind of just spoke when I was asking about the families, you mentioned the police officers, the crew that are on scene, and I'd love to go back to them because you have mentioned here that they may or may not have a spiritual background or a spiritual following right now. But I wonder, and maybe you can speak to whether they have mentioned to you that they now think about it more because of the amount of death they see on the job.
That's not an easy question to answer because cops are reluctant to be vulnerable, and they tend to their job and the kinds of stresses that they work around drive them to be a little bit more reserved emotionally. Sometimes it can get to them and they become a little more cynical and typically communicate less than average. Now, that being said, that stereotype that's not always the case. Just as sure as I say that, all cops are reluctant to talk about their feelings, you'll run into a cop that's just an open book and transparent about every thought and feeling that's ever flowed through their mind. And so you get all kinds. But most cops, I think, just like that family on a scene of a death where they appreciate someone being present, I've seen the officers that I am a chaplain for, I have seen them appreciate that I keep coming back to the patrol station and I keep going on ride-alongs and I keep spending time in their world because their world is very stressful and they see a lot of sudden death. They get called out and they never know. Every single day at work, they don't know if they might, in the next few minutes, be called to go stand next to a dead body for 3 hours.
Right.
I mean, that most of us would not be okay with that being part of our job. No. And they have that as a possibility. It doesn't happen every day, but it happens as a possibility. They could have to look right at death. Suicides of young people are difficult for cops because cops skew young. An old cop may only be 35 or 40 years old. And so all these young cops who are in their early to mid 20s, they see a young person kill themselves, and that is traumatic because they associate themselves with it. And some suicides are gruesome. Again, like I said, hands and face, those are things that we connect. Those are body parts of other people that we connect to. They're personal parts of our bodies. And if they see that, that can be pretty upsetting. And so I think that having someone experience it with them, I'm, on average, probably 15 or 20 years older than most cops. So I'm, if not a dad figure, I'm maybe kind of an older brother, and I can be there. And I am always trying to express a solemnity about the death. I don't encourage them to joke about the body at the time. There actually is a place where they do need to blow off steam like that, where they need to laugh. They need to tell, a joke that kind of falls in that category of gallows humor, but they need to not do it there.
Sure.
Because the body needs to have a seriousness about it. And there's always just the practical risk of a family member overhearing you.
Absolutely.
And so you need to be careful. Now, funny story. We were called out to a death here a winter or maybe 2 winters ago, and it was bitterly cold. It couldn't have been 20 degrees outside, and the wind was howling. And it was early morning, and we went into this rickety house that, the lights shining through the gaps in the wall, and pretty rickety. But the heat was on, and so it was better inside that house. And there was a deceased individual who had drank themselves to death. And they're surrounded by vodka bottles and all kinds of other debris and what have you. They had been gone long enough that rigor mortis had set in, so they were stiff. Their limbs were stiff. Well, the deceased was holding a large 40-ounce can of beer on his belly, and it was full, and it was balanced on his belly as he sat on the couch. And it was such an odd thing. It's like, is that a full thing of beer? It's not falling over. He held that. He's been holding it for hours. He's been gone all night. And here he is. He's still holding that. And all the cops are looking at it, and you can see it on their faces. They desperately want to comment. They want to joke about it. They want to laugh. And they were all being so professional. And not because I told them to, but I'm setting a tone because I'm there and I've got my hands folded in front of me and I'm maybe got my head bowed and I'm being very serious and they're being very professional. Then a family member walks in and starts laughing at the beer can and says, well, at least he died doing what he loved. And starts joking about it. And this is like a sister or something. She's joking about the body is like right there because we're all crowded in the room with the body, which is unusual. But it was so cold, we had no choice. And so you had a room full of people surrounding this dead body sitting on a couch. And it's the family member that's telling jokes. And I don't know if that was normal for that family, but I tell you, it did relieve a lot of stress for the cops because they need a little bit of that gallows humor, a little bit of that dark humor to get through and to manage and to process the traumatic things that they see. And so I really appreciated that family member kind of breaking the ice and being funny about it in a moment that's not very funny, but it was a little bit. And I laughed and they all laughed. And
yeah, I can see where that would definitely break the ice, like you said, and maybe not the ice, but the tension, because we all know what we're doing there. And I appreciate that you create a lead, so to speak, for them to recognize that this is not maybe the place for that, and when you will have that chance is when you're going to be able to express that. But if I could, let's just talk about your show for a minute. You have a podcast that's called Hey Chaplain. Yes. And you said that a lot of police officers, and I would say anyone who's dealing with tragedy on an ongoing basis, tends to be a little bit more cynical, less likely to be vulnerable and open. Who is on your show? Do you speak to them, or do you have guests, or how do they interact with you?
Yes, my show is almost exclusively an interview show. And so I talk to cops all around the country and really all around the world. I say on the show, from LAPD to Scotland Yard, I have cops from different countries and different cities that are willing to share wisdom about some aspect of being a cop. And so sometimes it's career related, like, hey, look, I was in this really interesting specialty, and let me tell you all about being part of this special unit that's really unique. And cops love to hear that stuff. They want to know about, where their career could go, because sometimes, like, if you're a detective and you're working, crimes that are violence against children, that's pretty taxing on you emotionally. And you may want to, and maybe you're good at it. Maybe you do it for 5 or 10 years, but you know what? You probably don't want to do it for 20 or 30. Yeah. And so it's helpful to think about other areas of law enforcement that you can help in, and when you can change gears and go in a different direction in your career. And so we talk about that stuff, or we'll talk about losing a partner. I interviewed a cop from Los Angeles whose partner was murdered. And how do you recover from that? I interviewed a cop from Florida who put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger, and it misfired. And his friend actually kept that bullet and gave it to him later, once he was in a much better place. But he wanted to end his life with suicide. And at that time in his life, that made sense. When he's describing it, I'm going to bet that most cops understand that feeling. But they also, I think, appreciated him navigating his way out of that and not wanting to take his life anymore and seeing that there was hope again. And so we talk about all kinds of topics, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but I try to keep a wide variety of subjects to encourage cops. And I say that if you like my show, tell a cop or someone who loves a cop, because that's really my audience. I'm really wanting to talk to the law enforcement community and their families. Certainly chaplains listen, because they're always trying to learn more about law enforcement culture. That's really how I guide my show, is I'm not a cop. I'm a chaplain, and I don't want to be a cop. I like doing what I do. I work in a church. I volunteer at the police department. I take care of these young officers, but if I'm going to take care of them well, I need to understand what their life is like. And so I am talking to people all around the world to understand law enforcement culture and break down all the myths and misunderstandings that a non-cop would get from watching TV, and understand what it's really like to be a cop. And so that's what the show is about, and it's gone well. I really feel like I keep a list of all the subjects I can cover, and the list keeps getting longer. even though I've been doing it for a couple of years. So I feel like I can just keep going. And I appreciate the opportunity to meet all these different cops all around the place. I just had one of the cops from California that I interviewed. He just came out to Kansas City to visit me, and I've gone to visit him. And so I'm developing friendships with law enforcement people all around the country.
Wow. And I would hazard a guess that it's a healthy relationship rather than being together kindred with the same job experience. You can step into his world and just be a different presence for him.
Yeah, there's an advantage for me, both with the podcast and with the chaplaincy, to not being a cop. Because if a cop wants to talk to me about something going on emotionally, trauma related, relationship related, whatever it may be, I am never going to sit on a review board. I'm never going to be part of internal affairs. I'm never going to be a commander that makes a decision about his discipline or his promotions. I am outside of that chain of command. And so there's a safety, and I'm under layers of, non-disclosure and confidentiality. And so he can come talk to me and gripe about how his sergeant doesn't like him, or maybe it's the sergeant complaining about his officer.
Sure.
It goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
But they can complain to me, and it ends there. They don't have to worry about it coming back and haunting them a few years later if the person they talk to is now their supervisor.
And I think for me too, being somebody who prefers to be in relationship with people, I don't like to have strangers in my life. I like to really know who I'm around and who's around me. I think that is really just some safety for them, and maybe to be a little bit vulnerable. On the other hand, now you are a man and you go through hard times and you hear a lot of what they say on the police side, but also in your ministry. How do you clear your head of a lot of the stuff that you experience?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm a person of faith, and so there's some resources there that I think give me an advantage, that help me. But also, I just need to do like what everyone else needs to do. I need to story tell my trauma. So that means talking to people and finding good confidants that I can talk to. And so the guy from California, he's somebody that I can call anytime around the clock. I can say, hey, I'm just leaving a scene, and boy, that's upsetting. And I can just talk to him. He can ask me how I'm doing and how am I eating? Am I exercising enough? He can keep me accountable. I've got another friend. He's a chaplain in Indiana. Same thing. I can call him anytime. That helps to have those connections with people, both here in Kansas City and, that I can call around the country. That's what we all need to do. People who are traumatized and they take it inside, they eat it and push it down and pretend like it never happened. Boy, that's, for most people, going to be a ticking time bomb. Most of us need to story tell our trauma. And so you don't have to talk about how you're feeling. And boy, good luck getting a cop to do that. Ask cops. So tell me how you feel today. They'll shut you down. They don't want to do that. But if you ask, well, where were you? What did you see? And they'll start reporting it, and they'll start using cop language. Here's I responded, code A to a 1047F, and they'll start using all this jargon. But then as they start going, they'll say, then I saw blood running down the curb, down the street. They needed to tell that detail out loud. They needed to have someone hear them say that. And that's therapeutic and good for them to get that out. And so I have to take my own medicine. If I'm going to tell them to do that, then I need to do the same thing. It's therapeutic for me talking to you today, to tell, the kind of things I do and some of the, the beer can story and whatever.
Well, and that's a pretty good story. If you're going to share one, I like that one for sure, because of the humor around it, and because it was humor acceptable to the family as well, because they initiated it.
Yeah,
I will say, seeing that yellow tarp, it was many years ago. I still see that, and on the news, or if I drive by or something and I see a yellow tarp, it just reminds me of that experience so many years ago. But I like what you said about being able to mention that. My kids don't understand the yellow tarp reference. My husband doesn't understand it because they've not experienced that. So to be able to share that with you,
But can you imagine the bond that you'll have when you come across somebody, even if it's accidental, just serendipitously, that you come across somebody else who's also seen a yellow tarp covering a body? Boy, now you've got a connection to that person. It'll be a bond that is unlike all the familial bonds that you have everywhere else. It's special to share that. So that's why having a helper like a chaplain on scene. I was there. I was standing in the rain. I saw and I smelled what they saw and what they smelled. Mm-hmm. And having that connection is meaningful to us. And so finding people who've seen the same kind of things, the guy in California and the guy in Indiana are both chaplains, both police chaplains. And so they see the same kind of stuff that I see. And if they have a bad day, they call me. Mm-hmm. and we talk it out.
Oh, yeah. And that's a gift. I'm so glad. And I know that they are really grateful to have you in that capacity. So there's two things that I want to kind of mention. During our conversation, when we were first getting to know each other, you said one person at every table will be a last survivor. Can you explain that a little bit?
Of the people at that table. Yeah. We have a almost superstitious reluctance to think about death. But, being a human being is 100% fatal. All of us will die, and many of us will die sooner than we expect. We have to take little baby steps to embrace our own mortality and the mortality of those around us. And so I don't want to be overly morbid, but yes, if you're sitting at a table full of friends or strangers or whatever, one of you will be the last surviving person from that table. That is always true. It's unavoidable. And sometimes a little brief mental exercise like that is a healthy reminder. We're not fixated on death, or we don't have an unhealthy fascination with it, but avoiding it isn't good either. And the same with birth. I mean, now birth happens at a hospital most of the time, or at least with experts, and it's all very controlled, sterile environment. Death, absolutely. Someone dies in the hospital, family's escorted out of the room. Mm-hmm. You don't see that body again until they're at the funeral home. And I'm not saying that's all bad. In many ways, those professionals that help with birth and death, that's good. But the unintended side effect of it is that we become insulated from the realities of birth and death.
Yes.
That life itself becomes something that professionals handle for us, and we don't think about, and we don't have to be confronted by it. And I don't think that's good for us. I really don't. I think that we would be better off to be around a dead body. Go to and I'm not saying go, grave rob anybody, but go to a funeral and make yourself, if you're not comfortable with it, sit in the back row of the funeral home and be in a room with a dead body. Mm-hmm. You can do that for 5 minutes. Maybe you could do it for an hour. And you don't have to go up and look at the body. You don't have to touch it, but, baby steps. Let's get ourselves comfortable with the idea that this body that I inhabit is not going to be here forever. Mm-hmm. And the bodies of my loved ones are not going to be here forever. And if you don't handle it in a healthy way, you'll handle it in an unhealthy way. And so if you don't process this, then when you are confronted with the mortality of your loved ones, what you'll do is you'll isolate yourselves from them. You'll prepare yourself for their absence by avoiding them. Mm-hmm. And you will ruin relationships, and you will become lonely, and you'll destroy the best things about living by avoiding death and avoiding the people that will die someday. And so stop doing that. They know they're going to die. You know they're going to die. We just all need to admit it and work little by little to become comfortable. We have a real pathological dysfunction when it comes to death. And we need to find little exercises and little ways to think about it more. And I'm preaching to the choir because obviously someone listening to your podcast has already taken that first step, preparing for death.
Yeah, maybe.
So I hope they're willing to take another step. Yeah.
Me too. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the man who was out in the parking lot at his own mother's funeral because he was unable to go that far as to be around her dead body. And I think if one person, by listening to my show or hearing you speak, can be a little bit closer to a dead body or being able to at least acknowledge their own mortality, I think that's a step in the right direction. Hopefully before they die, so that they can maybe take a few more steps as they get closer. But you also mentioned the word superstition, and that is a huge part of this removal of people from the death and dying process, is that if you don't know something, if you don't know the facts, you're going to fill them in with whatever your brain conjures up. And it's not always going to be close to the truth.
In many cases, it'll be unhealthy. It'll be unproductive. It will interrupt good, healthy relationships. It can be very bad. Yeah. And so, we really do need to be clear-minded about this stuff. And I'm saying that as a religious person. I mean, and I have a lot of religious belief around death. But when I say superstitious, I mean kind of a backward, unhelpful, unhealthy thinking. There are Christians who do that. There are non-Christians who do that. Mm-hmm. That's not unique to any one religion. It is a problem that is a human problem. And all of us, regardless of our religious disposition, need to break down those obstacles that I'm referencing when I say superstition.
Absolutely. I have seen different types of superstitions surrounding death and dying. And it's not that I'm going to try to push my beliefs on anyone, really. I try not to. I want to be a friend more than anything. And if my faith helps me be a better friend, then I'm going to be grateful for that piece of it. So I wouldn't push somebody out of their superstition, but I think I try to encourage communication and exploration. And I'm a preparer, so I'm always going to try to have somebody be as prepared as they can for whatever it is that they're facing. And we all know that we will face death, so why not prepare for that? So I had, and I don't even know how this came to me, 79 tasks that need to be addressed when you die. And I thought, wow, it would take a funeral director to figure out that there's 79 things that you have to do before you die, right? But what he said here, there's a little disclaimer. It says, the following is an extensive list of the numerous things that would need to be gathered and sorted through immediately after death. All bolded items can be planned before the time of need. Non-bolded items will need to be addressed after the death. And then they went and broke it down. And it's probably not surprising that under funeral arrangements has the most number of tasks at 31. It is from a funeral home after all. But vital information and documents, 27 tasks. And then they have here at the bottom, additional tasks are 5. But the last one is designate someone to look after children, plants, and or pets. And I'm looking at that going, that should have been up at the top. You should know who your people are, in my opinion, so that we don't have to scramble and figure that out after you're gone. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've seen some beautiful examples of that. Because people are not prepared, they don't put any thought into it. They're avoiding putting thought into it. Mm-hmm. A lot of these things are unresolved at the time of death. Now, I've seen some beautiful examples. There was a death notification that I performed here just a while back where a woman's adult son was killed in a car accident the night before. She was concerned. She thought, where is he and that kind of thing. And we went, a couple chaplains and a police officer, to her front door. And her neighbor saw us approaching. We pulled up in police cars. This neighbor came along with us to make the notification. She came out, the woman came out of her house, sat down on the front porch. We told her the bad news. We gave her the details that we had, contact information. And that neighbor swooped in and was ready to provide so many of the things we're talking about. Like, well, what are we going to do about the pets? What are we going to do about, getting this distraught loved one from point A to point B? Mm-hmm. What are we going to do? And frankly, some of those things we didn't have answers for. Sure. We were just making the notification. But this neighbor came in, talk about a bond closer than blood. She ministered well to her neighbor. And I just thought that was a beautiful thing. And so it's amazing the people that will rise to the occasion and do beautiful work to help people who are unprepared. But unfortunately, I think part of the reason I'm so sentimental about that particular example is because it's so rare. Most people are pretty isolated. We culturally, and we can't fix this now, but culturally, we've moved from, the way we built our houses. Our houses used to have front porches with porch swings. Now they have backyards with privacy fences. Mm-hmm. And we drive into a garage or whatever, and our neighbors never see us. Yeah. We put barriers up between us and our neighbors. We don't know the people in our neighborhood. I know we have 600 friends on Facebook, but we need real people in our lives who are going to be there when something bad happens. And so a lot of those things on that list can be resolved by some planning in advance. So I'm going to write down what my wishes are, and I'm going to cover probably several of those items that way. And then having connections with people, being willing to forgive and be patient with the people around you, because they have sharp elbows just like you and I do. Mm-hmm. And it can be difficult to interact with people and have relationships, but it's worth it, because when you need somebody, you need somebody. And there's nothing more painful than needing somebody and finding yourself to be alone. So building some bonds with people maybe you never really thought you could be friends with before, having people who are physically close to you is important. And it is highly beneficial to have that, to be able to cover a lot of things on that list, because you have people around you who can help you think through this. People who can step up and say, I'll run and get the kids from school or whatever. I know you can't do that right now, so I'll go water the plants. I'll take care of the dog. I know your dog's not been out in 5 hours. I'll go take care of that for you while you handle this. Man, having that person in your life, worth their weight in gold.
That is beautifully said. And I am not even going to add to that. I agree with everything. And hopefully it resonates with my listeners, but with also the people that you interact with and come to know in your life and in your line of work, both as a chaplain and as a pastor. As we are kind of coming to the end of our time together today, I would like to give you a moment or two to talk about if there's one thing, if it wasn't what you just said, if there's one thing that you would like to leave people with.
Well, I'm obviously biased. I have learned to love cops, and they and other first responders, particularly the fire department, the EMS, those first responders, they are willing to go face a lot of this for us. If there's a car accident, if there's a homicide, if there's any kind of sudden death, they go in first, and they bear the brunt of finding the body and turning that body over, perhaps because there's still some life there, and working on that body like the paramedics do. They pour themselves into trying to save that person. And a lot of times it's too late. Mm-hmm. A lot of times there's nothing that can be done. And I've walked in and seen a lot of dead bodies where they're still intubated. They still have the tube down their throat, and their shirt has been cut off because they were trying to shock the heart and do chest compressions. Those first responders, whether it was a firefighter, paramedic, or cop, they put everything they had into saving that stranger and trying to stave off death. Many times they're unsuccessful, and they take it personally. Mm-hmm. It hurts. It wounds them to not be able to rescue that person. That's why they put on the badge in the first place. Mm. They wanted to save people. They pictured themselves coming out of the burning building, carrying the person and rescuing them. And sometimes they're removing dead bodies, and it's too late. And so if you would consider that firefighter or that police officer, and if you can, show love to them. They have a tough job, mm-hmm. and they need support. They just don't get that love and support like they need. They have a lot of family problems. It's difficult to maintain a marriage and healthy relationship with your kids while going through that kind of stress. They need help. They need support. If you're a person who prays, pray for them. If you're a person in a position where you can be near them, don't assume what they need. Everyone thinks, well, what they need is Christmas time. I'll give them a tub of popcorn. Mm. They like that, sure. but that's that's probably not at the top of their list. You might consider asking, well, what do you guys need? Maybe you're in a small town with a small department, and those officers have to buy a ballistic panel for their bulletproof vest out of their own pocket, and that's like $1,000. Oh. Well, what if you did a fundraiser and every rookie police officer that comes into your town, which in a small town might only be just every other year, what if you bought those ballistic panels for them? That would be something that maybe their department would really need because they don't have the budget for it. And those police officers and their loved ones would really appreciate that extra layer of protection. So you'd have to ask, is this even something you guys need? You could reach out and ask, what kind of things do you want? What kind of things would help you? And that's a very selfless way of helping, is to genuinely be curious and ask, how can we help you?
I love that. To give them the opportunity to express their needs in maybe, like you said, where often they don't get to express much at all about what they experience.
Yeah. Oh, I guarantee you, in most cases, they're going to be very touched that you cared enough to ask instead of just assuming. Mm-hmm. Everybody just assumes. And you would never know unless you ask.
I like that. Thank you for even putting that out there. I appreciate that, Jared. We can conclude if you're all set, unless there's something else that you'd like to share. I know that you've got an evening ahead of you, and so I want to be respectful of your time. But you're easy to talk with, and I could listen to you for much, much longer. And maybe we can do it again.
Well, I would be happy to. I'd be happy to.
All right. Thanks so much, Jared. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. You can go to my website for more articles, little news pieces, or a transcript of this podcast. The website is whilewe'restillhere.com. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can send me an email too. Thanks again, and until next time, take care.